In this video, we're going to go over the Super Jump and the Super Run power-ups. Now, these are made with a combination of animation, the Mona Reactor, and the Mona Player Property Volumes component. So, check this out. These highlighted areas are just for demonstration purposes so that when you drag and drop it into the stage, you actually understand where the area where the super jump activity can actually happen. So we've got our trigger object, our super power up right here, and once we touch it, it actually turns on our super jump capability. And once we're outside of this player property volumes area, we've got another event that basically says to shut it off. Now with the Super Run, it's basically the same exact principles using the same exact components, the Mona Reactor and the Mona Property Volumes. And if I touch the Super Power Up, we now have fast running capabilities. And when we leave the space, we have another trigger that basically says to turn it off. So now in Unity, in order to customize this for your own space, all you have to do is drag and drop the prefabs into your environment, and then you're going to manipulate. Let's say, for example, this is the runway or the area where the power up for the Super Run is active if the player is within it. So all you're going to literally want to do is just modify its size, its position to wherever it is, that area that you want the Super Run power up to exist for the player to activate and utilize it in that space. Same thing with the Super Jump power up. As you can see, we've got this semi-transparent area here. Now these are just here, you can see them so that you can actually manipulate them in your space however you want them to. One thing to consider is with the Super Jump power up, you want to make sure it's tall enough so that when your character jumps, it still has that effect with the motion blur, chromatic abrasion, and bloom that lets the player know that they're actually being within the space and they have the Super Jump power up or the Super Run power up activated. So real quick, this utilizes the player property volumes component, which is attached to the player power up area Mona PPV, which you can see in the Super Run and the Super Jump power up, these two objects here. And if you look at the parameters, you can see it includes gravity, jump height, walk speed, sprint, bloom, chromatic abrasion, and motion blur. So with the Super Run power-up, we're modifying the walk speed and the sprint speed, whereas with the Super Jump power-up, we're modifying the jump height. We're also modifying the bloom, chromatic abrasion, and motion blur on both of these PPV components so that when the character steps into that area, triggers the object, you can see the effect in the environment itself with the motion blur, bloom, and chromatic abrasion to let the player know that right now the power-up is active. Now, once you're done with implementing this in this space, more than likely, unless you have some reason for using it, you're going to want to turn off this highlight so that it's invisible. All you need to do is go into the inspector for that object, the PPV object, for whichever power-up you want to modify, and just uncheck mesh render. So that all still completely works, we just don't see it. That's it. And of course, if you want to modify the location of the power-up itself, just go ahead and move that power-up to wherever it is you want it. Now let's take a look under the hood. So the Super Jump and the Super Run power-up both have in their hierarchy a power-up reactor object. As you can see here, there's the one for the Super Jump, here's the one for the Super Run, power-up reactor object. Now that's just to let you know that that's an object associated with the power-up object, but also that it includes the Mona Reactor component on it. So we look at the inspector, we can see we have the Mona Reactor, and this instigates our triggers, right? So in this instance, we're actually utilizing it to trigger 3 different events. So on the onEnter trigger event, meaning that when the player touches this object, enters its collider space, that we're going to trigger what I called the icon power up get, the particle burst, and the super jump on. Now you can create them however you wish. There are other videos that you can look at. If you click on any one of the power-ups, you'll see a link to the tutorials or the Mona Playground in the inspector. You can click on that to find more information on how to utilize the reactor. But real basic, you basically click the plus sign to add an event. You can give it a name. You can decide whether or not how you're going to modify a parameter associated with the object that you want to modify or trigger an event on, and we'll get into that in a minute. So let me just delete that real quick. We're not going to get into that too deep, but here we go. We've got 3 different events. we've got a icon power up get. That's our first event. So that basically just means that's what I called it. And if we look at the power up reactor and we look at the animation, we can see the icon power up get animation in here. And in the animator, we can see the icon power up get. This is our default state. And if we look at the animator, we can see that we have a parameter. It's a Boolean, meaning that it's true or false. We can set those here, create new ones. And it's just a Boolean parameter for got power up, that when the transition, its condition of got power up equals true is true, then it instigates the icon power up animation. And that animation is just simply that the power up disappears. So again, on the reactor object, our first event is basically saying set the got power up parameter of the power up reactor object. So I dragged and dropped that object on there and set it to true. It's a Boolean parameter, set it to true. So when that's true, it triggers our animation and our power up disappears. Now, the second event that happens is the particle burst, which is just basically similar principle. This is our particle system. You can see that it's basically turned off right now. You can't see it, obviously. And in the animator, we've got a similar functionality. We've got an on parameter, and if the particle's condition or the condition on is true, it instigates the particle's on animation, which is right here. So if I turn that on, it turns on our particle system and we get our little star animation that happens. Now we have our third parameter, or third event I should say, that gets triggered on enter of our power up object, and that's the super jump on. So in that instance, we're going to the player property volumes, which is the area that has the PPV component that instigates the power-up event or activity. And we're basically saying the power-up area Mona PPV, set the parameter status to true. So if we look at the power-up area Mona PPV, we can see that we have a PPV pad on animation. And in the animator, we can see that we have a status parameter, which is also, again, just the true or false. And in the transition to the PPV pad animation to turn it on, we've basically got, if the status equals true, go ahead, initiate the transition. Now we also have, you can see in this instance, we have a second transition back to our default state to turn the pad off, so that when the user exits the trigger area, we set the status to false so that we can turn it off. So if we go back to the power up reactor, actually the power up area Mona PPV object, that's the one that when the user exits that area, we want to turn it off. So we've attached a reactor to that object as well, but this time we've got an on exit trigger, which is basically, I just called it super jump off, and we're basically setting the power up area Mona PPV's status variable or parameter to false, so that we basically turn it off. So if we look at the animation, we can see right here that the box collider by default is off, and if we play the animation that gets triggered, it turns it on, and then once again, if we turn it off, it just basically goes back to our default state. And so it goes back to our default state, and the box collider is checked off. Now, the super run power up is literally the same exact thing.